The dust had not yet settled on the horizon when Lucy Quinn loaded the second rifle. She had seen the smoke signals from 3 miles out, thin gray threads unraveling against the copper belly of the afternoon sky, and she had known before the messenger arrived, before the horse came thundering down the long dirt road that cut through her property like a scar, before any living soul opened their mouth to tell her what was coming. She had known because she had been expecting it for 6 months, ever since Harlan Briggs had offered her $400 for 300 acres of prime grazing land along Sweetwater Creek, and she had told him, with all the calm dignity her late father had taught her, exactly where he could put his $400. That had been October of 1882. Now it was April of 1883, and the cottonwood trees were budding pale green along the creek, and the grass had come up thick and sweet across the south pasture, and Lucy Quinn had 12 cattle, 47 sheep, a barn that needed a new roof, a vegetable garden that was finally doing something right, and absolutely no intention of surrendering a single inch of it to Harlan Briggs or anyone else who rode under his flag. She was standing on the porch when she saw the rider coming, and she watched him the way she watched everything carefully, with her chin slightly lifted and her gray eyes narrowed against the glare. He was pushing the horse harder than was kind, which meant he either had urgent news or poor judgment, and as he came closer she could see from the set of his shoulders that it was the former. He pulled up short of the porch steps, raising a plume of tan dust that drifted slowly past her face, and she did not step back from it. He was not a man she recognized at first. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way that men get when they have spent more time outdoors than in, with dark hair pushed back under a battered brown hat, and jaw that carried 2 or 3 days of dark stubble. His shirt was dusty and his boots were worn at the heels, and he had the look of a man who had been riding hard for a purpose that was costing him something. He pulled off his hat and held it against his chest, which surprised her. Men who rode for Harlan Briggs did not take their hats off for anybody. "Are you Lucy Quinn?" he said. His voice was low and direct, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on ornamentation. "I am," she said. "My name is Jasper Wilcox," he said. "I used to ride for Harlan Briggs. I don't anymore, and that's a longer story than we have time for right now. What I came to tell you is that Briggs has put together a party of 8 riders. They mean to come out here tonight after dark and run you off this land. He's had papers drawn up claiming ownership through some kind of irregular deed dispute, but those papers are fraudulent. The county recorder in Millhaven is on his payroll. I know because I saw the money change hands." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. The horse shifted beneath him, blowing softly, and somewhere across the pasture one of her sheep called out in the late afternoon silence. "I know," she said. Jasper Wilcox blinked. It was the only sign of surprise he gave. "You know," he repeated. "I've known since Tuesday," she said. "Tom Garrity at the feed store heard Briggs talking about it in the back of the Silver Horn and got word to me." She paused, studying him. "What I don't know is why you rode out here to tell me yourself, when you used to be on his payroll." "Because what he's doing is wrong," Jasper said, and the words came out flat and simple without any performance in them, which was the only reason she believed them. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and went back through the door of the house, and when she came back out she was carrying a rifle, a Winchester model 1873 that had belonged to her father, and that she kept cleaned and loaded and ready. She held it out to him, stock first, and met his eyes squarely. "Then choose a side," she said. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. Then he reached out and took it, and he wrapped his hand around the stock with the ease of a man who was comfortable with weapons, and something shifted in the space between them, something quiet and serious and not entirely about the situation at hand. "All right," he said. "I choose yours." Lucy Quinn had come to this piece of land with her father 12 years ago, in the summer of 1871, when she was 16 years old and her father was 42, and full of the kind of hope that men carry west like water in a cracked vessel. Her mother had died of fever 3 years before that, in Missouri, and the move west had been her father's way of outrunning the grief that had taken up permanent residence in the house they left behind. They had traveled with a small party of settlers, 7 families in all, and of the 7, only 2 had settled in this particular valley in the southwestern corner of the New Mexico territory. And of those 2, only Lucy's family had stayed longer than 3 winters. Her father had been named Edward Quinn, and he had been a fair man and a stubborn one, which was a combination that served him reasonably well on the frontier. He had built the house with his own hands over 2 summers, the stone and timber structure that still stood solid and cool against the heat. He had dug the well. He had planted the garden. He had run cattle and sheep and had done well enough to keep them both fed and clothed, and occasionally in possession of something almost like comfort. He had died 4 years ago, in the winter of 1879, of a heart that simply stopped one February morning without particular drama or warning, and Lucy had buried him under the old juniper tree at the north edge of the property, and had gone back into the house and continued the work. She was 28 years old now, and she had been running this land alone for 4 years, and she had done it with a kind of fierce, quiet competence that was either admired or resented depending on who was watching. The neighboring ranchers, the few who were honest men, admired her. Harlan Briggs resented her, which was mostly because she sat between his 2 main parcels of land, and because Sweetwater Creek ran through her property, and he wanted that water access badly enough to do ugly things about it. She made Jasper Wilcox unsaddle his horse and put it in the barn, because a horse that had been ridden that hard deserved rest, and then she made him sit at the kitchen table and eat the stew she had on the stove, because a man who was going to help her through the night ahead needed to be fed. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone genuinely hungry, and did not speak until she sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you know about the 8 riders," she said. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and then caught himself and used the cloth napkin she had set out, which was the kind of small social awareness that told her something about him. 3 of them are Briggs's regular hands, fellows named Cutter, Vane, and a big Texan they call Rope because that's what he likes to use. The other 5 are hired men, gun hands, brought in from Tucson from what I heard. Hired for what specifically, she said. Intimidation first. Briggs wants you gone without a body to answer for. He'd rather you packed up and rode out than have to explain anything to the territorial marshal. Jasper paused. But the hired men from Tucson aren't the kind who care much about what comes after. If there's trouble, they won't hesitate. There will be trouble, Lucy said, without alarm, as simply as if she were reporting the weather. I figured you'd say something like that, Jasper said, and there was the briefest suggestion of something that might have been admiration at the corner of his mouth. You said you used to ride for Briggs, she said. How long did you ride for him and why did you stop? He was quiet for a moment and she watched him decide how much to tell her. 2 years, he said, started in the fall of '81. I was coming back from driving cattle up to Santa Fe and I needed work and Briggs was hiring. He presented himself as a straightforward rancher who needed hands, and for the first year that's mostly what it was. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Then this past winter he started pushing on the smaller operations around the valley, pressuring people, using the law when he had it and other means when he didn't. He looked up at her. I'm not proud of some things I was present for. I want to say that plainly. I didn't participate, but I was present, and there came a point where being present was its own kind of participation. So you left, she said. 3 weeks ago, he said. Rode out without a word. He knows I left angry. I don't imagine he was surprised to see me heading in this direction. That means, Lucy said carefully, that when those men ride in tonight, they may be expecting you to be here. That possibility had occurred to me, he said, and this time the suggestion at the corner of his mouth was definitely something like rueful acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth. Which means you may have complicated my situation, she said. Or I may have simplified it, depending on how the night goes, he said. Lucy stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard. The sun was getting low, throwing long gold shadows across the packed dirt, and the cottonwoods along the creek were lit up like torches. It was a beautiful evening on a beautiful piece of land, and the beauty of it sat in her chest like an ache. "How many guns do you have?" she said. "My Colt and the rifle you gave me," he said, "and I'm a decent shot." "Decent isn't confidence-inspiring," she said. "Better than decent," he said. "I won't miss what I'm aiming at." She turned back to face him. "I have 2 rifles, the one I gave you and my own, and a shotgun that my father modified. I have enough ammunition to last longer than 8 men with any sense would want to stay." She paused. "I also sent word this morning to Tom Garrity and a man named Eli Marsh, who runs the spread to the east. They may come and they may not. I don't count on men I can't see." Jasper nodded slowly. He had the kind of face that processed information visibly, not in an open or naive way, but in the way of someone who was genuinely thinking things through rather than simply performing consideration. It was a face that had seen some weather and some difficulty, and had arrived at a kind of settled plainness that she found easier to trust than beauty. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've had 6 months to think it through," she said. "This is my land. My father's hands built this house. His blood and his hope went into this ground. Harlan Briggs isn't going to take it with a fraudulent deed and 8 hired riders any more than the devil takes things he hasn't earned." Jasper looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. It was not pity, which she would not have tolerated. It was not admiration of the patronizing kind that men sometimes offered women who displayed unexpected competence. It was something quieter and more considered, something that seemed to be genuinely seeing her rather than constructing an image of her. "No," he said simply, "he isn't." They spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing. Lucy knew her land the way she knew her own breathing, every dip and rise and shadow, and she moved through the planning with a precision that Jasper followed without question or suggestion, unless she asked for one. She positioned herself on the porch with the shotgun, which had the advantage of range and authority. She sent Jasper to the left side of the barn, behind the water trough, where he had a clear line of sight to the main entrance of the property and could cover the approach from the south. She moved the 2 horses into the back pasture beyond the barn, hobbled loosely so they could move if they needed to. She covered the window of the house with her spare blankets to prevent anyone inside from being visible by lamplight. She ate a cold supper and brought Jasper a piece of bread and dried meat, and they sat for a few minutes in the cooling dark outside the barn and ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Where are you from originally?" she asked, because the waiting was its own kind of pressure and she found she wanted to know. "Georgia," he said. "Originally. Left when I was 19. He chewed thoughtfully. "My father had a farm and 3 sons, and not enough land for any of us to make a real go of it. My oldest brother got the farm. My middle brother went into the railroad business in Atlanta. I went west." "How old are you now?" she said. 26, he said. "You?" 28, she said. He nodded as if this were simply a useful piece of information and not a social calculation, which she appreciated. "Do you have any regrets about coming west?" she said. He thought about it genuinely, which she noticed. "Not about coming west, no," he said. "About some of the choices I made once I got here, yes. The 2 years with Briggs most of all." He was quiet for a moment. A man can tell himself he's just following orders, just doing a job, right up until the moment he can't tell himself that anymore. "I stayed too long past that moment." "What made you finally leave?" she asked. He turned his hat over in his hands in the dark. "There was a family," he said. "Mexican family, name of Ruiz, had a small plot of land about 12 miles west of here near the old Mission Road. Briggs wanted the water rights to the creek that ran through their land. When they refused to sell, he sent men to tear down their fence lines and scatter their cattle." He paused. "I was there. I didn't tear anything down. But I stood and watched it happen, and I didn't stop it, and the oldest son of that family was maybe 16 years old, and he looked at me while it was happening, just looked at me, and I have not stopped seeing that look since." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "What happened to them?" "They held on," he said. "Last I heard they were still there. Briggs hasn't moved on them again yet. He turned his hat over once more. I went back before I left. Told them what I knew about Briggs's plans and offered to help them reinforce their fence line. The father, Senor Ruiz, he thanked me, but he didn't trust me, and I don't blame him for it. That was still something, Lucy said. It was not enough, he said, but he said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of accounting. She looked at him in the dark. The moon was coming up, large and yellow over the eastern ridgeline, painting the yard in pale silver, and in that light he looked very young and very serious and very tired, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she did not immediately put a name to, only noted it the way she noted everything, carefully and with attention. They heard the riders before they saw them, the soft collective drumming of hooves on dry ground that came from the south, slower and more deliberate than urgency, which told her they were coming carefully, planning to approach quietly. 8 horses, she counted the sound of them, which matched what Jasper had told her. She pressed herself against the porch support post and held the shotgun easy, and she heard Jasper's careful movement as he settled behind the water trough. And then everything was still and patient as the riders came into the silver yard. They came in a loose group, 7 visible and 1 hanging back at the fence line, and the man at the front was not Harlan Briggs himself. Briggs was not the kind of man who put himself in the middle of his own dirty work, but a man she recognized as Cutter, a lean, weather-dark figure with a rifle across his saddle. "Lucy Quinn," Cutter called out, and his voice had the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. "We have legal papers here transferring title of this property to the Briggs Land and Cattle Company. You have until dawn to gather your belongings and vacate the premises peacefully." Lucy waited 3 full seconds before she spoke, because 3 seconds of silence from the porch of a darkened house had a particular quality to it that she wanted them to feel. "Those papers are fraudulent," she said. "The deed to this land is properly recorded in my father's name and transferred to me at his death, witnessed by Judge Alderman of Millhaven County. You are trespassing." There was a murmur among the riders. Cutter had not expected her to be out there, and he had not expected her to speak so directly. He recovered quickly. "Now, Miss Quinn, there's no need for this to get complicated. Mr. Briggs is willing to offer you a fair price for your relocation, and we can all walk away from here peaceful and easy. I want you to think carefully about what you do next," Lucy said, and she made her voice carry without raising it, which was a skill her father had taught her. "I am not alone, I am armed, and I have enough patience to outlast every man among you. Ride back to Harlan Briggs and tell him that Lucy Quinn is not moving, not tonight, not ever, and the next time he sends men to my property I will have the territorial marshal here with papers of my own." The silence that followed had a texture to it, something pressed and tight, and she was watching the rider's hands and watching the one hanging back at the fence line, and from the left she heard Jasper Wilcox shift his weight behind the water trough, a deliberate sound, loud enough to be heard, making it plain that there was someone there. Cutter turned his horse slightly. He was calculating. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. 8-2 were fine odds in an open confrontation, but she had the porch and the darkness and the uncertainty, and she also had, she was fairly sure, more nerve than any of the 8 men in her yard, and men who do ambush work for money are not generally men who enjoy uncertainty. "There's going to be a day of reckoning on this property," Cutter said, and the threat was real enough but also the words of a man who was preparing a retreat. "That day is not tonight," Lucy said. Cutter sat a moment longer. Then he turned his horse and raised his hand to the others, and they pulled away, slow and deliberate, the way men do when they want to appear unfrightened even as they are leaving. The one at the fence line wheeled and went first, and within 2 minutes the sound of hooves had faded south and the silver yard was empty. Jasper came out from behind the water trough and walked to the porch steps and stood there looking up at her. "You have a remarkable way of speaking," he said. "My father's voice," she said. "He could stop a storm with it." She realized she was still holding the shotgun with both hands and her knuckles had gone stiff, and she consciously released her grip and set the stock on the porch floor and let herself breathe. The shake in her hands was small and she controlled it quickly, but he saw it, and he did not comment on it or make it into something, which was exactly right. "They'll be back," he said. "I know it," she said, "but not tonight and not with the same plan. I bought us time." "What will you do with the time?" he said. "Go to Millhaven," she said. "In the morning. Get in front of the county judge before Briggs does, with my legitimate deed documents and whatever testimony you're willing to provide about what you witnessed." He looked up at her steadily. "I'll testify," he said. "Whatever you need." She looked at him in the moonlight, this man who had ridden out of the dark to warn her, this man who had taken the rifle she offered him and stood beside her without a moment's hesitation, and she felt that shifting in her chest again, more certain now, more specifically shaped. "You should sleep in the barn tonight," she said. "It's late and Millhaven is a full day's ride. We leave at first light." "All right," he said. "There are extra blankets in the tack room," she said, "and a lantern on the hook by the door." "Thank you," he said. She went inside. She barred the door and sat in the kitchen by the low light of the lamp and held her father's deed papers in her hands, reading the familiar words she had read 100 times, the careful legal language that represented her father's life and her own. And she thought about the man sleeping in the barn, and she thought about the riders who would come again, and she thought about what she was going to say to Judge Harmon Alderman in the morning, and the one thought that kept surfacing through all the others, unbidden and a little startling, was the way Jasper Wilcox had wrapped his hand around the rifle stock with such quiet certainty when she handed it to him and said, "Choose a side." They rode out at dawn, when the sky was still that deep clear blue that comes just before the sun, and the air had the particular freshness of a high desert morning that Lucy had loved since the first time she had experienced it as a girl, riding out with her father to check the fences. The ride to Millhaven was 22 miles of hard country, rock and scrub and red clay arroyos, and they rode side by side on the main track without speaking much for the first hour, each of them alert to the land around them, watching for riders, comfortable enough in the shared silence not to need to fill it. It was Jasper who spoke first, when they came down into a long flat valley and the pace could ease. "Tell me about your father," he said. She glanced at him. The question surprised her and didn't. "Why?" she said. "Because you mention him the way people mention someone they're still in conversation with," he said. "And because this land was his first, and I feel like I should know something about the man whose land I helped defend last night." Lucy was quiet for a moment, looking at the red clay track ahead of her. "His name was Edward Quinn," she said. "He came from Ohio." He believed, honestly and without irony, that a man could make something good in a new place if he was willing to work hard enough and be honest enough, and he was both of those things every single day of his life, even when the land didn't cooperate, and the weather turned, and the cattle got sick. She paused. "He taught me to read by the lamplight after supper every night, and he taught me to shoot and to ride and to figure figures and to negotiate a fair price. He said the greatest disrespect a person could show the world was to be helpless in it." Jasper listened without interrupting. She liked that about him, she was finding. He had the particular gift of listening that did not feel like waiting to speak. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Jasper said when she finished. "He was," she said. "He would have liked you, I think." The words came out before she had fully considered them, and she felt a small heat in her cheeks, but she kept her eyes on the track and did not qualify the statement because she had meant it. He glanced at her with something careful and warm in his expression. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, and the simplicity of it sat between them like something good. Judge Harmon Alderman was a 60-year-old man who had been on the bench in Millhaven County for 11 years, and who had the look of someone who had not been surprised by anything in at least 8 of those. He was a compact, white-haired man with a perpetual expression of measured skepticism and hands that moved with deliberate economy. He received them in his office at the courthouse, which was a single-story adobe building at the north end of Millhaven's Main Street, and he looked at Lucy's deed documents for a long time before he said anything. "I'm acquainted with the claim Harlan Briggs is making," he said at last, setting the papers down. His attorney filed an affidavit with the county recorder's office last month asserting that the original title transfer to your father contained an error in the land description that would render it invalid. He looked over his spectacles at her. "I have not ruled on this matter because no one has brought it formally before me. Mr. Briggs's attorney has been managing to keep it in a state of administrative uncertainty." "Because Martin Dole in the recorder's office is on Briggs's payroll," Lucy said, without raising her voice. Alderman regarded her evenly. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "I can support it," Jasper said. He had been standing slightly behind Lucy's chair, and now he leaned forward. "My name is Jasper Wilcox. Until 3 weeks ago I was employed as a ranch hand by Harlan Briggs. I was present in the Briggs main house in February of this year when Briggs paid Martin Dole $120 in cash in exchange for Dole's agreement to delay processing of any counter-documentation that might be filed on behalf of the Quinn property. I heard the conversation and I saw the money." Alderman looked at him for a long time. "You understand that testifying to this would make you an adversary of a powerful man," he said. "I do," Jasper said. "And you're prepared to do so. I'm here, aren't I?" Jasper said. The corner of Alderman's mouth moved. He looked back at Lucy. "Miss Quinn, I'm going to need you to file a formal petition to quiet title on this property, which will compel Briggs to bring his claim formally before this court rather than continuing to work through administrative channels. I will assign it to my docket for the 20th of this month, which gives his attorneys 2 weeks to prepare a proper response." He looked at the deed again. "Your documentation appears sound. If your father's original survey matches the recorded description and this man's testimony is credible, I don't see a strong basis for Briggs's claim." "It will match," Lucy said. "My father surveyed it himself and had it witnessed by 2 men who are both still living in this county." "Good," Alderman said. He looked at Jasper. "I'll need a written deposition from you before you leave Millhaven today. My clerk will assist you." He turned to Lucy. "In the meantime, I would advise you not to be on your property alone. Briggs will not like what you've done here today." "I'm aware of that," Lucy said. They were in Millhaven until mid-afternoon, Lucy signing papers and Jasper giving his deposition to the clerk. A precise young man named Whitfield who wrote in a careful copperplate hand, and asked Jasper to repeat himself twice to make certain he had everything exact. When it was finished and they stepped back into the bright heat of the main street, Lucy stopped and put her hand out to Jasper, a formal gesture. He took her hand and shook it, and the grasp of it was warm and sure. "Thank you," she said. "What you did in there takes courage. What you've been doing for 4 years on that land alone takes more," he said. She kept her hand in his a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he kept his around hers, and then she released it and looked up the street at the general store, and said she needed to get supplies before they rode back, and he said he would see to the horses, and they separated with the careful ease of 2 people who are becoming accustomed to each other's company, without yet being entirely sure what to do about it. They rode back slower than they had come, the horses loaded with supplies, and the afternoon sun worked its way across the sky and turned everything gold and rust. They were about 4 miles from the Quinn property when Jasper pulled up and held up a hand, and Lucy stopped beside him and followed his gaze to the ridgeline to the west. There were 3 riders on the ridge watching them. They were too far away to identify, but they were not making any effort to conceal themselves, which was itself a message. "Briggs knows," Jasper said. "He has someone in the courthouse," Lucy said, "or someone who rides by it quickly. Do you want to go around?" he said. She thought about it. Going around would add 2 hours to the ride and would still bring them to the same property. "No," she said. "We go straight, speed up to a canter, and don't look back at them." "All right," he said, and matched her pace when she moved, and they rode the last 4 miles at a strong canter while the afternoon shadows lengthened, and the 3 riders on the ridge watched them but did not follow. When they arrived back at the Quinn property, Tom Garrity was sitting on the porch steps, and beside him was a broad, sun-dark man of about 50 who introduced himself as Eli Marsh, and who had the manner of someone who had come prepared to stay. "I got your message," Eli Marsh said to Lucy, looking at her and then measuring Jasper with a brief, assessing look. "Who's this?" "Jasper Wilcox," Lucy said. "He's with me. He used to ride for Briggs." Marsh's expression shifted through several registers and settled on skeptical. "Did he? He came to warn me last night," Lucy said, "and he testified before Judge Alderman this afternoon. He is on our side." Marsh looked at Jasper for another moment and then looked back at Lucy with the practical acceptance of a man who trusts the judgment of the person he has come to help. "All right then," he said. Tom Garrity was a wiry, red-faced man in his 50s, who ran the feed store in town, and who had been a friend of Edward Quinn's for 20 years, and felt himself to owe something to the daughter of that friendship. He had brought 2 of his hands with him, young men named Pete and Cal, who both had the eager and slightly uncomfortable look of people who had wanted an adventure, and were now in one. They reinforced the property over the next several days in ways that were practical rather than dramatic. Eli Marsh had brought extra lumber, and they repaired the fence lines on the south and west approaches, which would slow mounted riders and funnel any approach toward the main yard. Jasper worked beside them with quiet efficiency, asking useful questions and making useful suggestions, and Lucy watched him work and found herself watching him more than was strictly necessary for the purposes of evaluation. He had a way of moving that was economical and purposeful, without the self-consciousness that some men bring to physical labor when they are being observed. He worked hard and he did not complain, and he had a natural ease with the other men that was social without being performative. And when the day's work was done, he helped Lucy make supper without being asked, simply coming into the kitchen and picking up the tasks that needed doing, which caught her off guard the first time, and then became something she moved around naturally, the 2 of them occupying the kitchen together with a domesticity that was both comfortable and slightly charged. On the 3rd evening he asked if he could see her father's surveying records, and she sat with him at the kitchen table after supper, while Marsh and the others were in the barn, and they went through the documents together. He was good with numbers and maps, better than she had expected, and he caught a discrepancy in the Briggs claim that their own attorney in Millhaven had not noticed, a boundary marker reference that Briggs's fraudulent documentation had moved by a 1/4 mile, which placed the apparent error of the deed right at Sweetwater Creek, which was precisely the point. "It's not after your land for the grazing," Jasper said, his finger on the survey map, leaning close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. "He's after the water rights to the creek. The rest is just leverage." "I know," she said, "but the deed covers the creek as part of the property. If he can invalidate the deed, he can claim the creek is unattached. Then the key is making sure the court agrees that the deed is valid and always was," he said. "Which is why your testimony matters," she said. "If Dole can be shown to have been corrupted, his administrative delay holds no weight, and the deed stands as recorded." He turned his head slightly, and they were quite close, both of them bent over the spread map, and she was aware of the closeness with the whole surface of her awareness. He did not move back from it, and neither did she, and for a moment they were simply 2 people in a lamplight kitchen on a quiet spring evening, and the legal documents on the table between them were very still. "Lucy," he said, and the use of her name alone without the Quinn was different from before in a way she felt clearly. "Yes," she said. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more careful. "I didn't come here only because I wanted to do the right thing. I came here because I've known about this property and about you for months, from what the men talked about at the Briggs Ranch, and every single conversation I heard about you was about how you couldn't be broken and wouldn't be moved and weren't afraid of anything. And I don't know exactly what that did to me, except that I thought about it more than made sense for a man who'd never met you." She looked at him for a long moment, not moving back, not moving forward either, just looking at him with those steady gray eyes. "That's a very roundabout way of explaining yourself," she said. "I'm not sure I can explain myself any more directly," he said. "Try," she said. He held her gaze. "I came here to warn you because it was the right thing to do, and then I took the rifle because I wanted to stand beside you. And I've spent 3 days building your fences and reviewing your documents because I don't want to leave, and that has less to do with Harlan Briggs and everything to do with you. And I am aware that I have no particular right to feel that way about a woman I have known for 72 hours. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the night insects were singing in the grass along the creek, and the lamp threw its warm gold light across the table and the maps and his serious, slightly uncertain face. "I have never needed a man to have a right to something before he could say it to me," Lucy said. "I just needed him to be honest when he said it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm being honest." "I know you are," she said. "I could tell the first day." She looked down at the map and back up at him. "I'm not a woman who lets things come easily," she said. "This land, this life, all of it, I have fought for every piece of it, and it has made me careful and it has made me slow to trust, and I will not apologize for that." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "But," she said, and there was something that was almost the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth, "I'm also not without feelings, Jasper Wilcox, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend that I haven't been thinking about you as well, and for reasons that also have less to do with Harlan Briggs than with the person sitting across this table from me." He looked at her with something opening in his face, something careful and warm. "All right then," he said softly. "All right then," she echoed, and the smile came properly that time, and it changed her face into something that was less the face of a woman at war and more the face of a woman who had opened a door she had been standing in front of for some time. They did not do anything further about it that night, because there was too much at stake, and too many people in the barn, and too much practical urgency to let sentiment run ahead of sense. But something had been said and acknowledged, and it sat between them from that night on with the comfortable weight of a truth that has been spoken aloud. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed with a particular quality of alertness. Briggs's men made 2 more appearances at the property boundary, watching, measuring, communicating through their mere presence that the fight was not over. Eli Marsh stayed with his 2 horses at the Quinn property, and Tom Garrity's men Pete and Cal came and went, and Jasper was always there, always steady, working through the days with a kind of settled authority that had settled into the property as if it belonged there. He slept in the barn, and they maintained the respectful distance that the circumstances and the presence of others required, but they found ways to be alone that were not contrived. Early mornings before anyone else was up, when Lucy was feeding the chickens and Jasper was watering the horses, and they would talk in the quiet, cool air about everything and nothing. Late evenings when Marsh had gone to his bedroll, and they sat on the porch steps and watched the stars come out one at a time over the dark ridgeline. These were not dramatic moments. They were the quiet, specific moments of 2 people building a vocabulary with each other, learning the particular language of another person, and they were the best part of Lucy Quinn's days in a way that surprised her and did not surprise her at all. She told him about growing up in Missouri and the mother she had lost too young. He told her about Georgia and the older brothers who had marked out the limited boundaries of his possibilities before he was old enough to understand that boundaries were not walls. She told him about the first winter on the New Mexico land when she and her father had nearly starved and had eaten dried grass soup for 6 days and had not once spoken of quitting. He told her about the drive north to Santa Fe and the way the country opened up when you got into the high desert, and the particular feeling of riding into a space so large you understood, for the first time, what freedom actually felt like in the body. On a Thursday evening 12 days before the hearing, She was standing at the garden fence pulling the first young weeds from between the onion rows when he came and stood at the fence on the other side. He had been fixing the north gate all afternoon, and his shirt was dusty, and his hands were rough, and he had a small cut on the back of his left hand from a nail that had gone sideways. "You should put something on that," she said, nodding at the cut. "It's nothing," he said. "Come to the house," she said, and it was not quite a command and not quite an invitation, somewhere between the two. She cleaned the cut at the kitchen sink while he stood very still and let her, and she was aware of the smallness of the kitchen and the warmth coming off him, and the fact that when she looked up he was watching her with an expression that had nothing careful or measured about it at all, an expression that was simple and clear and direct. "Lucy," he said. She looked up at him properly. This close she could see the exact color of his eyes, which were the sort of brown that looked darker in shade and lighter in sun, and they were very much in shade right now in the dim kitchen, and they were very much looking at her. "Yes," she said, and the word came out softer than she had intended it. He lifted his hand, the one she was not holding, and touched her face with the backs of his fingers, the gentlest touch, the kind that asked rather than asserts, and she leaned into it by the smallest fraction, and that fraction was her answer. He kissed her then, quietly, without urgency, as if there were all the time in the world which there was not, and which neither of them cared about in that particular moment. It was a first kiss that was honest and warm and sure, and when it ended she stood there for a moment with her eyes still closed and her hand still holding his cut hand, and then she opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "We still have a hearing to get through." "I know it," he said, and he was smiling now, full and real, and it was the first time she had seen him smile like that without reservation, and it did something significant to her. "After the hearing," she said. "After the hearing," he agreed. The morning of the hearing, Lucy Quinn dressed in her best dress, which was a deep blue wool she had bought 2 years ago and almost never wore because there was rarely occasion for it, and because it made her feel self-conscious in a way that she did not quite know what to do with. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she thought about her father, and she thought about 11 years of work, and she squared her shoulders and went out to saddle her horse. Jasper was already in the yard, wearing a coat he had borrowed from Eli Marsh, which was slightly too broad across the shoulders but gave him a formal, serious appearance that was appropriate to the day. He looked at her when she came out of the house, and the look was not the social one that men gave women in their good dresses. It was quieter and more personal, the look of a man who is seeing something he has privately claimed. They rode into Millhaven in a group: Lucy, Jasper, Eli Marsh, and Tom Garrity, who had felt that the occasion warranted his presence as a witness to what he had heard at the Silver Horn. They arrived at the courthouse at 9 in the morning to find Harlan Briggs already there with his attorney, a sharp-featured man from Santa Fe named Kellner, and 2 of his regular hands waiting outside on the steps. Harlan Briggs was a man in his 50s, broad and well-fed, with the coloring of someone who spends time outdoors but not at physical labor, and he had the habit of looking at things as if calculating their value. He looked at Lucy Quinn the way he always had, as if she were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. And then his gaze moved to Jasper Wilcox, and something happened in his face that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but contained elements of both. "Wilcox," he said flatly. "Mr. Briggs," Jasper said, and the evenness of his tone was its own kind of statement. "I'll have you know there are men in this territory who will not work with a traitor," Briggs said. "I'll keep that in mind," Jasper said, and did not say anything else, and they walked past him into the courthouse. Judge Alderman ran the hearing with the particular efficiency of someone who has a full docket and a low tolerance for ornamentation. Attorney Kellner presented the Briggs claim, which rested on the assertion that the original deed filed by Edward Quinn in 1871 contained a transcription error in the boundary description that created a defect in the title. He cited the affidavit that Martin Dole had filed on the matter, supporting this interpretation. Lucy's attorney, a local man named Weston who was less polished than Kellner but more honest, presented the original survey records, the witness testimony from the two men who had been present at the original survey, and the chain of title documentation showing the property's transfer to Lucy at her father's death. He also submitted to the court the deposition that Jasper had given 2 weeks earlier. Alderman read the deposition carefully while the courtroom waited, and then he asked Jasper to take the stand and affirm his testimony in person, which Jasper did, clearly and without hesitation, describing in specific detail what he had seen and heard at the Briggs Ranch house in February. Kellner cross-examined Jasper with some vigor, attempting to establish that his testimony was motivated by personal grievance against his former employer. Jasper agreed that he had left Briggs's employ under disagreeable circumstances and agreed that he had personal objection to Briggs's methods, and then said, "My personal opinions about Mr. Briggs have nothing to do with what I heard and saw. I am describing facts, not feelings." Alderman sustained Weston's objection to Kellner's next question and moved on. It took the judge less than an hour of deliberation to return his ruling. He found that the deed recorded by Edward Quinn in 1871 was valid and clear, that the boundary description, properly read in conjunction with the original survey records, contained no genuine defect, and that the claim by the Briggs Land and Cattle Company had no legal foundation. He further noted, in language that was careful and pointed, that the matter of Martin Dole's conduct as county recorder would be referred to the territorial attorney for investigation. Harlan Briggs left the courthouse before the ruling was finished being read aloud, which told Lucy everything she needed to know about the quality of his character. She stood on the courthouse steps in the blue dress in the late morning light and breathed, and she felt the whole weight of 6 months of tension and 12 years of defending her father's legacy move through her and out of her, and what was left when it went was not emptiness but space, clean and open, the way the high desert felt after rain. Jasper came and stood beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. "Well," he said at last. "Well," she agreed. "Your land is still yours," he said. "My land was always mine," she said. "Now the judge agrees with me, which makes it more convenient." He laughed genuinely, and she heard the laugh go through her like the first warmth of a spring morning, and it made her smile. And they stood there on the courthouse steps in the sunlight together, while Tom Garrity shook her hand and Eli Marsh clapped Jasper on the shoulder and said something gruff about good work. And it was a moment that had the particular quality of things arriving exactly where they were supposed to. Briggs did not send riders to the Quinn property again. The referral of Martin Dole's conduct to the territorial attorney caused Dole to resign his position and leave Millhaven in a considerable hurry, and without that administrative lever, and with a clear court ruling against him, Briggs had no practical path forward on the Quinn land. He redirected his attention elsewhere, as men like him always do when one avenue closes, but the particular avenue that ran through Lucy Quinn's property was closed permanently. 2 weeks after the hearing, in the warm beginning of May, Jasper Wilcox was still on the Quinn property, which had been on the surface of things a practical arrangement based on the needs of a working ranch that was short of hands and long on work. He had rebuilt the north fence entirely. He had repaired the barn roof. He had dug the trench for an extended irrigation channel that would bring water from Sweetwater Creek to the kitchen garden without the need for daily bucket hauling. He worked with the purposeful engagement of someone who is not doing a job but building something, which was a distinction that Lucy felt clearly and did not comment on, at least not directly. On a Saturday evening in the middle of May, she made a proper supper, not the practical meals of the busy weeks but a real meal, a roasted chicken with dried herbs, biscuits that she made from her mother's recipe, stewed apples from last autumn's canning. She set the table with the good plates that had come west with her father from Ohio, and she put a jar of wildflowers from the creek bank in the center because they were there and they were pretty. Jasper came in from the barn and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and at her, and she met his eyes with the directness she brought to everything. "Sit down," she said. He sat down and she sat across from him, and they ate together in the warm kitchen with the windows open to the May evening, and the conversation moved easily through half a dozen things before settling into a comfortable quiet, and it was in the quiet that he said it. "I need to tell you what I'm thinking," he said. "All right," she said. "I'm thinking that I came here for a night and I've been here for a month," he said. "And every single day of that month has been the best day I've had in 6 years of living on my own in this territory. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I don't think it has anything to do with the land or the work, though both of those things are fine." She looked at him over the good plates and the wildflowers. "I think I've been falling in love with you since you handed me that rifle and told me to choose a side," he said. "And I think that might have started before that, in whatever way you can fall in love with a person you've never met, through the idea of them, the shape of who they are. And I know that you are not a woman who does things halfway or because the circumstances are convenient, and so I'm not asking you to do anything halfway either." He paused. "I'm asking you to let me stay. Not as a hand, not as a convenient practical arrangement, but as a man who loves you and wants to build something real with you on this land that you have given everything to keep." The kitchen was very still. The evening light came in gold through the open window and lay across the table and across his face, which was as open and honest as she had ever seen it. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said. She was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet about everything important, considering it fully and without performance. But the truth was that she had known the answer for weeks, had known it in the way she knew the sound of the creek and the smell of rain coming over the western ridge, had known it as something as intrinsic to her understanding of herself as the deed to her land. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, Jasper Wilcox." He reached across the table and took her hand, and the grip of it was warm and sure, the same grip she had felt the day they shook hands outside the judge's office in Millhaven, and she held onto it with both of hers, and they sat there in the kitchen in the last gold of the May evening, and let the reality of what they had said settle around them like something that had always been there waiting. They were married in July of 1883, on the Quinn property, under the old juniper tree where her father was buried, which felt right and necessary in a way that she could not have explained but did not need to. The ceremony was performed by a Methodist minister named Reverend Doyle, who traveled a circuit through the valley and who asked few unnecessary questions, and had the practical good sense to conduct a ceremony that was meaningful without being interminable. Tom Garrity and his wife were there. Eli Marsh and 2 of his hands stood in the shade of the barn. A family named Verla, who had a small plot 3 miles to the east, came with their 4 children, and the children chased the chickens in the yard, while the adults said serious things in the shade of the juniper tree. Lucy wore the blue dress again, and had her hair pinned up in a way she had not bothered with since before her father died, and she stood next to Jasper under the juniper tree, and felt her father's presence in the ground and in the air and in the quality of the light, which was the high summer light of the New Mexico territory, flat and golden and relentless, and full of a beauty that demanded to be acknowledged. When Reverend Doyle asked if there was any reason these 2 should not be joined, there was a moment of silence in which Lucy thought about everything that had brought them to this particular tree on this particular day: the riders in the night, the rifle handed across a porch railing, the testimony in a courtroom, the evenings on the porch steps with the stars coming out one at a time, and she thought there was no reason at all. After Doyle pronounced them married, Jasper turned to her with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and then he smiled, the full, unguarded smile she had first seen in the lamplight kitchen, and it came over his face like the sun coming over the ridge, and she kissed him properly in front of everyone under the juniper tree, while Tom Garrity's wife made a small, approving sound, and the Verla children temporarily stopped chasing the chickens. The reception was a long, easy afternoon in the yard, with food that various neighbors had contributed, and a fiddle that Eli Marsh produced from somewhere and turned out to play with genuine skill and considerable enthusiasm. Lucy danced with her husband for the first time on the packed dirt of her own yard, while the fiddle played and the sun moved across the sky, and she thought about how land becomes place and place becomes home and home becomes the people in it. And she thought about the particular mercy of good things that arrive after long difficulty. And she felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was not vigilance, not strength, not the will to hold on, but something lighter and more expansive than all of those things, which was simply happiness. The summer of 1883 and into the fall they worked the land together, and the working of it together was different from the working of it alone in ways that Lucy had not entirely anticipated. It was not simply that there were 2 sets of hands, though that was a practical benefit that made real differences to the daily labor. It was something less quantifiable, the way that shared work creates a particular kind of intimacy, the way 2 people who work in the same space day after day come to understand each other's rhythms and preferences and capabilities in a depth that is not available through conversation alone. She learned that he was better with the cattle than with the sheep, which were the opposite of her preference, and that he had a natural affinity for horses that went beyond riding into something like mutual communication, and that he was the most patient fence builder she had ever seen, methodical and careful, taking the extra time that made the work last. She learned that he was a light sleeper and an early riser, and that he made coffee that was stronger than she liked, which she told him, and he made it slightly less strong as a compromise, which she accepted. He learned that she could not cook biscuits without burning the bottom of the first batch, without exception, and that she had an absolute authority over the vegetable garden that he entered only by invitation, and that she cried at the graves of animals in a way she did not cry at anything else, and that she had a habit of humming to herself when she was happy that she was not aware of, and the sound of it became, to him, one of the specific pleasures of his days. They argued twice that fall properly about real things. The first time was about whether to sell 4 of the cattle before winter to have cash in hand, or keep them through the winter on the hope of a better spring price, an argument that lasted 2 evenings and was resolved in her favor because she knew the market, and he conceded the point with a grace that she appreciated. The second argument was about the old roof, which he wanted to replace entirely before winter and she thought could be patched through another season, and that argument he won, and she helped him put on the new roof in October and conceded later that the winter was better for it. They were not arguments that left marks. They were the kind of disagreements that 2 people with strong minds and genuine respect for each other navigate, and they navigated them with the honesty that had been between them from the first night on the porch. In December of 1883, Lucy realized she was pregnant. She sat with that knowledge for 2 days before she told Jasper, not because she was unsure about his reaction, but because she wanted those 2 days for herself, to hold the knowledge privately and turn it over and feel the full weight and wonder of it without needing to manage anyone else's response. On the 3rd morning she told him at breakfast directly, the way she told him everything, and he was very still for a moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that had too much in it to name all at once, love and awe and something that was not quite disbelief but was adjacent to it. "A baby," he said. "In late spring, I think," she said. "Maybe June." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then he held her with the careful strength of a man who is aware that he is holding something precious. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I don't have a word large enough," he said. The pregnancy was not easy in the way that frontier pregnancies rarely were, but it was not dangerous either, and Lucy approached it with the same practical competence she brought to everything, making accommodations where she needed to and refusing to make them where she didn't, which led to some gentle negotiations about which kinds of physical labor were appropriate at which stages. Negotiations that Jasper won through patience and persistence, and the evidence of his general reasonableness rather than through any assertion of authority, which was the only way Lucy would have listened. Eli Marsh's wife, a capable woman named Ruth who was 55 years old and had brought 4 children into the world on the frontier, came and stayed at the Quinn property for the last 2 weeks of May. And it was Ruth who helped Lucy through the labor when it came on a warm night in the 2nd week of June. And it was Ruth who placed the baby in Lucy's arms in the gray hour before dawn and said, "You have a son, a son." Lucy looked at the baby, who was red-faced and outraged at the interruption of his previous existence, and who had dark hair that might have been from either of them and dark eyes that were too young to show their real color. She looked at him for a long time, and she thought about her father under the juniper tree, and she thought about the land that this child would inherit, and she thought about what it meant to have something to leave behind that was worth leaving. Jasper came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. He looked at the baby the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table the night he asked her to marry him, with everything he had in him, nothing held back, nothing managed. "What will we call him?" Jasper said. Lucy had been thinking about this. "Edward," she said. "Edward Quinn Wilcox." He looked at her. "Your father's name," he said. "He earned a piece of this," she said. Jasper nodded slowly and reached out and touched the baby's hand, the tiny fist of it, and Edward Quinn Wilcox grabbed Jasper's finger with the automatic grip of newborns, the grip that makes no distinction between parent and stranger, but applies itself with complete trust. And Jasper looked at his son holding onto his finger in the early morning light and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. Edward was 3 months old when news came that Martin Dole had been formally charged by the territorial attorney with bribery and official corruption, which was not news that would change the day-to-day of the Quinn Wilcox household, but which satisfied Lucy in a way that was not precisely about revenge and more about the basic accounting of right and wrong, the sense that things, however slowly and imperfectly, occasionally arrive where they belong. Harlan Briggs, without the leverage of the corrupted recorder's office, and with the legal judgment against him on the Quinn property now standing as a matter of public record, had turned his attentions entirely to land further west and was reported to be in ongoing dispute with a mining company over water rights near the Arizona border. He did not trouble the valley again in any form that reached Lucy and Jasper directly, and his absence was the best news he could have given them. Tom Garrity visited in October, when Edward was 4 months old, and held the baby with the uncertain but charmed expression of a man who does not often hold babies and finds he does not mind it as much as expected. He told them that Pete, one of the young men who had come out to help during the Briggs trouble, had taken up with a widow woman over near the Verla spread, and seemed to be settling into the valley permanently, which was the kind of news that suggested the valley was becoming something, accumulating people and connections, and the kind of social fabric that made a place real. The Verla family came to visit in November, the father and mother and their 4 children, and there was a meal that sprawled out of the kitchen and onto the porch and into the yard, and the Verla children played with the baby while the adults talked and ate. And there was a moment in the late afternoon when Lucy looked around at all of this, the friends, the food, the child, the man beside her, the land going gold in the November light, and felt the fullness of it with a clarity that was almost painful in its completeness. Jasper caught her expression and leaned close and said quietly, "What are you thinking?" She considered how to answer that. "I'm thinking about the night you rode up to this porch with news I already knew," she said, "and I gave you a rifle and told you to choose." "The best choice I ever made," he said. "It wasn't bad for me either," she said, and she said it with the smile that came fully now, easily, the one she had found somewhere in the space between the rifle and the juniper tree and the kitchen table and the creek, and all the mornings and evenings of the life they had built here. As the winter of 1883 moved toward spring, the property had a settled, particular quality that Lucy had always felt about it, but that now had a different dimension to it, the dimension that comes from a life fully inhabited rather than merely defended. The fences were sound. The barn was whole. The creek ran clear and strong along the south pasture, and the cattle and sheep that moved across the grass were her cattle and sheep and Jasper's. And the house was warm with lamplight in the evenings and the smell of supper cooking. And Edward Quinn Wilcox slept in the cradle that Jasper had built from juniper, wood taken from a dead branch of the tree in the north yard. And sometimes at night Lucy would stand in the doorway of the room where the baby slept and listen to the sound of his breathing, which was the smallest and most certain sound in the world, and feel the full reality of all that had been preserved and all that was growing. In the spring of 1884, they planted the garden together for the first time, both of them, turning the soil in the early April light while Edward sat bundled in a crate set at the garden edge, and regarded the proceedings with the interested, serious expression he was beginning to develop, the expression that was already recognizably his father's. They planted corn and beans and squash, and the onions that Lucy had been growing successfully for 3 years, and tomatoes that were always a gamble in the dry heat, and a row of sunflowers along the fence because Jasper had said once that he thought sunflowers were an argument in favor of existence, and she had agreed with him. The law of the territory moved slowly and was not always fair, and Lucy knew this with the clarity of someone who had stood in its courthouse and watched it in operation. The Ruiz family to the west, whose cause Jasper carried in the back of his conscience, was still in their position, still holding their land, still managing the daily difficulties of life in a place that did not always protect the vulnerable with the same vigor it protected the powerful. She and Jasper had ridden out to visit them in the fall, a visit that began with the formal wariness that Jasper had anticipated and ended better than he had expected, and Señor Ruiz, the father, who had looked at Jasper across the destroyed fence line with an expression that had lived in Jasper's memory since, had shaken his hand at the end of the visit and said, carefully and with intention, that a man who changes course when he understands he was wrong is a better man than one who never errs. Jasper had not said much on the ride home after that. He had been quiet in the way of someone processing something that mattered. And Lucy had let him be quiet because there are things that need space, and she understood that. Later that evening he had said to her, "I want to make sure we are always the kind of people who notice when something is wrong and do something about it." "We are," she had said simply. He had looked at her. "How are you so sure?" "Because you came out of the dark to a stranger's porch to warn her of something that was none of your business," she said. "A person who does that is the kind of person who notices." He had been quiet for another moment, and then he had said, "You gave that stranger a rifle." And there had been warmth in it, and she had said, "I did." And she'd do it again. And they had been in complete agreement about that. The spring of 1884 brought also the news from Millhaven that Martin Dole had been convicted of the bribery charge and had been sentenced and removed from public life, which was a small, formal confirmation of what they already knew. Weston, the attorney, sent a brief note about it that Lucy read at the kitchen table, and then tucked away with the deed papers and the survey records and the other documents that were the paperwork history of the property, the written account of the land's survival. By the summer of 1884, Edward was walking, a fact that delighted Jasper to an extent that Lucy found both endearing and slightly exhausting, because Jasper's response to Edward's walking was to stand at a slight distance and hold out his arms and call to him, and Edward would navigate the uncertain terrain between them with the absolute confidence of someone who has no doubt about his destination. And Jasper would scoop him up when he arrived and hold him up in the air and make a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a laugh, and that Lucy had never heard him make before this baby came into their lives. She watched this from the porch one late afternoon in July, the father and the son in the yard, the evening light going golden across the pasture, and the creek catching the light beyond, the sheep moving in their easy collective way through the south grass. And she thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing on this porch with a shotgun, waiting in the dark for men who had come to take her land. She thought about how she had stood in that dark with her heart going steady and hard, and her will utterly firm. And she thought about how she had never been afraid of being alone in the way that some people were afraid of it, had never needed company to feel safe, had built herself a life that was complete by any reasonable standard. And then she thought about the rifle she had handed to a stranger and told him to choose. She thought about how the choice he made had not saved her land. She had been going to save her land regardless, with or without Jasper Wilcox, because it was her land and she was her father's daughter, and it was not in her nature to give up ground. The choice he made had done something different. It had brought a person into her life who matched her in the specific ways that mattered, who was honest and stubborn in the right proportions, and who loved the land she loved and who made her laugh, and who held their son in the air in the evening light like he was the best thing the world had ever produced, which, in their particular accounting, he was. She went down the porch steps and crossed the yard to where they were, and Jasper turned with the baby on his hip and looked at her with that expression she knew as well as she knew the creek and the light and the season, warm and specific and entirely hers. "The sheep are in the south pasture," she said. "I checked the fence this morning," he said. "It's good." "I know you checked it," she said. "I was just noting the fact of the sheep." He smiled at her. "There's a lot to be grateful for out here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the pasture and the creek and the sky. "A considerable amount," she agreed. Edward looked at her with the serious brown eyes that were now clearly his father's, and reached one small hand toward her face, the reaching gesture of someone who wants to touch the thing they're looking at. And she caught his hand and held it and felt the grip of him, small and absolute, and thought that some truths were not available through language and could only be held. They had a second child in the fall of 1885, a girl they named Rose, because Jasper said it and Lucy immediately agreed, and she arrived into the world with considerably less drama than her brother had, and with a loud, decisive cry that suggested she had opinions about her arrival and intended to make them known. Edward, who was 2.5 and had the serious, methodical temperament of both his parents in equal measure, regarded his new sister with the careful interest of a scientist encountering a new and somewhat noisy phenomenon. The years moved across the Quinn Wilcox property with the quality that good years have, full and particular, each season bringing its own work and weather and small drama and quiet satisfaction. The cattle herd grew. The sheep did well. The vegetable garden became something of a local source of pride, and Ruth Marsh's wife came in the summer to help with the canning, and the kitchen grew hot and fragrant with the work of it. The house was expanded by 2 rooms, built over the course of one spring and summer by Jasper and Eli Marsh and Tom Garrity's son-in-law, who had turned out to be a capable carpenter, and the new rooms gave Edward and Rose their own spaces, and gave Lucy and Jasper the first real privacy they had had since the baby arrived. The property became, over time, not just a piece of land defended and held but a proper home in the fullest sense, a place with a past and a present and a future visible in the faces of the children who grew up in its spaces, learning the same things Lucy had learned from her father: to work, to be honest, to know the land under your feet, to be neither helpless nor afraid. In the evenings they sat on the porch after supper, when the children were in bed and the stock was settled, and they watched the stars come out over the ridgeline the way Lucy had always watched them, but now with Jasper beside her, his arm along the back of the bench, and they talked about the day and the work and the plans and sometimes about nothing at all, and sometimes they were simply quiet together, which was its own kind of conversation. One such evening in the late summer of 1886, with the night warm and full of cricket sound and the smell of the dry grass coming in from the south, Jasper said, "Do you remember what you said to me the first day, when you handed me the rifle?" "Choose a side," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've thought about that a lot over the years, the way you said it." He paused. "You weren't frightened." "I was frightened," she said. "I was frightened the whole time. I just didn't have the luxury of showing it." He looked at her. "You never told me that." "You didn't need to know it then," she said. "You needed to know I was capable, not that I was scared." "I would have thought more of you for it," he said, "not less." "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it then. I hadn't learned yet that the right person makes it safe to be afraid." He was quiet for a moment. The cricket sound washed in and out on the small, warm wind. "Have I done that?" he said. "Made it safe." She looked at him in the dark with all the directness she had brought to everything from the very beginning. "You have," she said, "more than you know." He took her hand on the bench between them, and she let him hold it, and they sat together on the porch of the house her father had built with his own hands, on the land her father had claimed with his own hope, in the life she had built with her own will and defended with her own courage. And she felt the full, specific weight of all of it, the difficulty and the sorrow and the long work and the joy. And she felt the man beside her as part of all of that, threaded through it now. As essential as the water in the creek and the grass in the south pasture and the juniper tree in the north yard where her father slept. She had not needed to be saved. She had never needed to be saved. But there was something else, something different from saving, that two people could do for each other in a life that asked as much of you as this one did. Something that was not rescue but companionship, not dependence but choosing, over and over, to be on the same side of the same line. She had handed him a rifle on a porch in the dark and told him to choose, and he had chosen, and she had chosen back, and they had been choosing ever since, every morning and evening and season, in all the small and large ways that a life is made. And there was nothing in that choosing that had cost her anything she was not willing to spend. The New Mexico Territory moved toward statehood through the years that followed slowly, as everything moved out here, and the valley filled in a little more with each passing season, new families arriving, new homesteads being staked, the land being parceled and settled in ways that were not always just and were not always kind, but were the complicated, ongoing story of a place becoming something. Lucy and Jasper watched this with the perspective of people who had already been through their particular test of it, and knew what land meant, and what it cost, and what it could hold. Edward Quinn Wilcox grew up to be a serious, capable young man with his mother's gray eyes and his father's way with horses. And he showed, from the time he was old enough to understand the story, a particular interest in the history of his family's land, in the deed documents and the survey records, and the story of the night his parents had stood against 8 riders with 2 rifles and the truth. It was a story he asked to be told more than once, and each time Lucy told it, she told it without embellishment but without reduction either, because it was a story that deserved to be told whole. Rose Wilcox grew up loud and determined, and more like her mother than either of them had fully anticipated, with a particular talent for numbers and a complete indifference to the suggestion that some things were not for women, which she had absorbed from her mother's example rather than from any particular instruction. She became, in time, a person of considerable local account, but that was a story still in its beginning in these years. The land held. The creek ran. The juniper tree grew another ring for every year that passed over Edward Quinn's resting place, and the property that had been homesteaded by a man from Ohio who had carried his hope west like water in a cracked vessel, was now carried by his daughter and her husband and their children, and it was not cracked at all. It was solid and sound and real, the way things are when they have been defended by people who understand what they are defending and why it matters. On the morning of the 15th anniversary of Edward Quinn's death, Lucy went to the juniper tree alone, as she did every February, and stood with her hand on the bark, and said what she said every year, which was not prayer exactly and not conversation exactly, but something between the two, the particular communication of the living with those whose influence does not end with their dying. She told him about the cattle and the garden and the new room they were thinking of adding to the east side of the house. She told him about Edward, who had recently demonstrated that he could survey a fence line as accurately as a professional surveyor with half the equipment. She told him about Rose's recent discovery that she could balance a financial ledger faster than Tom Garrity's new assistant, a fact she was deploying with a quiet competitive satisfaction. She told him, as she told him every year, that the land was sound and the deed was clean, and the creek ran all the way to the south pasture, and Harlan Briggs was someone else's problem and had been for years. And she told him about Jasper, which she also did every year, because she felt her father deserved to know the full accounting. She told him that the man who had ridden out of the dark to warn her was still here, had been here for 3 years and then 5 and then 10 and now 15, and that she had been right that her father would have liked him, and that the liking would have been mutual. She told him that she was happy, in the full and specific sense of the word, not the happiness of the absence of difficulty, but the happiness of a life that was genuinely and entirely hers, built by her own hands on the ground he had prepared for her. She stood at the juniper tree for a long time in the February morning, and then she heard Jasper's step behind her and felt his hand on her shoulder, and she covered his hand with hers without turning around, and they stood there together at the tree in the cold, clear morning while the juniper branches moved very slightly in the small wind coming off the ridge. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Good morning," she said. "How is he?" Jasper said, which was what he always said, and it was not ironic or dismissive. It was simply his way of acknowledging that the conversation at the tree was real. "He's well," she said. "Or at least the tree is, and I take that as a sign." He moved beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it. This woman who had stood straight and alone on a porch with a shotgun, and told 8 riders that she was not going anywhere. This woman who had made herself out of will and difficulty and love. And she leaned into the warmth of him and looked at the tree, and felt the wholeness of her life with the same clarity she had felt that moment in the July yard watching father and son in the evening light. The clarity that comes from a life that is fully itself. "What are you thinking?" he asked, as he had asked in the yard that evening years ago. She thought about it the same way she thought about everything. "I'm thinking," she said, "that some things are worth holding onto with everything you have." He held her a little tighter, which was his answer. "And," she said, with the beginning of the smile, "I'm thinking the fence on the east side needs attention before the cattle work this week." He laughed, and the laugh went out into the cold February morning and up through the juniper branches, and across the land that stretched out from this tree in every direction. Her land, their land. Edward Quinn Wilcox's land and Rose Wilcox's land after that. The land that had been held by love and stubbornness and 2 rifles in the dark, and a choice that had been made freely and kept faithfully. And the laugh was as good a sound as the creek and the wind and the morning. And it was as much a part of this place as anything that had grown here. The West was not kind, not consistently, not to everyone. And Lucy Quinn Wilcox knew that as well as anyone who had lived in it for any length of time. She had watched it take her mother and her father and neighbors and friends, and she had watched it bend and break and occasionally crush the people who came to it with too much hope and not enough preparation. But she had also watched it offer something that was not available in the settled places, something that had no clean name but was related to the idea that the shape of your life was not entirely determined before you arrived, that a woman on a porch with a shotgun could stand her ground, that a man who had made wrong choices could choose differently, that the line between who you had been and who you were was a line you could move. She had moved it. He had moved it. They had moved it together in the direction of something real. The juniper tree stood, the creek ran, the deed was clear, the children were growing, the land was theirs. And every morning when Jasper Wilcox woke in the house that Edward Quinn had built and looked across at his wife, who was already awake because she was always already awake, and met those gray eyes that had looked at him on a porch in the dark and offered him a rifle and a choice, he chose the same side he had chosen on the first night, and would go on choosing for every year that was given to them. And there was no version of the story in which he chose differently. And there was no morning on that land that was not, in some essential way, the best morning of his life.